everyone. Welcome. I'm Ritu Bhasin, she, her, hers. I am president and founder of Bhasin Consulting, Inc., which is an equity, diversity, and inclusion firm based out of Toronto, Canada, which is where I'm presenting from today. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you all here joining us, and it's a pleasure and honor, a privilege for me to be presenting this webinar to you on behalf of BCI. So first of all, Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory, and I just want to take a moment to honor and acknowledge these lands that I am on as being a member of Toronto and living in Canada. And as I do so, I'd like to invite you all to think about and honor and acknowledge the lands that you are on around the world and joining us today. So Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas, a treaty that brought these communities together to serve and to honor and to protect these lands. And we have all been invited into this treaty with the same spirit. And I share this with you as part of my personal commitment to truth and reconciliation and healing with the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and my team's commitment to the same. We hope that all of the work that we do at BCI is in furtherance of this. And while I'm mentioning the commitment to our work, I also wanted to say that we hope deeply that all of the work that we do is also in furtherance of interrupting systemic anti-Black racism. And if you have been webinaring with us now for over a year, I can't even believe it's been a year since COVID hit, but anywho, hit here in Toronto, in Canada anyhow, you'll know that these are commitments and priorities that we take very, very seriously. And I hope the spirit of these words carries through our session today. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters to kick off. So first of all, we are using Zoom technology today, Zoom. Love-hate relationship with Zoom. Hate it because there's too much Zoom, but love it because it helps us to bring communities together and to have conversations like these. We are using Zoom webinar technology in particular. So your cameras are all off and your mics are all muted. We cannot hear you and we cannot see you. However, we want this to be as interactive an experience as possible today. And in fact, if you Zoom webinared with me before, you'll know I very much favor a very interactive way of presenting. So a number of ways to make that happen. We'll ask questions of you throughout the session, polling questions, I'll ask questions and invite you to provide your comments in the chat box. You can throw up your questions in either the chat box or in the Q&A box. You can raise your hand when we're talking. But in particular, I'm really going to focus on using the chat box a lot. So if you haven't already done so, would you please open your chat box up? And you'll see that Ashley of my team has put a comment in there, so have I. So first of all, I am going to use the chat box repeatedly to invite you to put your comments up and any questions that you have as well. Now, this is important. In the to line, you'll see in the chat box, it'll say panelists or panelists and attendees. Can I please invite you to highlight panelists and attendees? The reason for that is because when we have panelists and attendees highlighted and we provide our answers, you can see everyone's responses. So you can see everyone's comments. So for example, I'm throwing in a hi now. You should all be able to see my hello. And in fact, we're going to get you warmed up in using the chat box. So highlight panelists and attendees. And here is my warm-up question. And by the way, I know what I'm asking you. I always cheat when I do this. So I know what I'm about to ask you, and I type my answer up before I've even asked you the question. Haha, so I've already done that. So here is my warm-up question for you, and please put your answers into the chat box. What is one thing in this moment that you are grateful for? And I'm putting down Simran and Raman, my two co-panelists who will be joining the conversation today. I can't wait to talk to them. So a lot of you are putting in your health and family. Those are really lovely answers. I often answer that too, but sometimes all I'm grateful for is Netflix or red lipstick or that I took a breath. And if that is your answer, I'm not mad at that either, because you just got to roll with whatever you feel grateful for in the moment. Okay, and by the way, the weather is warming up in many of the parts of the world that we all come from. And so it's finally nice to have nice weather. So yay for that too. Okay, so this is exactly how I'd like us to use the chat box. Please keep it open as a way for us to engage throughout today's discussion. I love this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So let's get into the webinar then. So first of all, and actually in the chat box, can you just throw a yes or a no? Have you ever attended a BCI webinar before? Yes or no, have you attended? So, okay, so a lot of yeses, but a few no's. Okay, so this is good. For the no's, welcome, and you're gonna get a feel for what it feels, a flavor for what of what it feels like. And for those of you who have said yes, thank you so much, welcome back. So happy to have you here. So this webinar is particularly special for me, and it's special for me in particular because I identify as being a member of the Sikh community. And when I say Sikh, I am a Sikh. My faith is called Sikhism. Let's already start decolonizing practices and systems in our sharing today. You'll often hear Sikh and Sikhism pronounced as Sikh and Sikhism. This is not the correct pronunciation. In the Sikh community, we say Sikh and Sikhism. And in fact, you can even correct your, or say to your, not correct, allyship, you can say to your Sikh friends, I know it's actually Sikh, and say it the right way as we work very hard to decolonize language. So as a member of the Sikh community who has been teaching in the equity, diversity, inclusion space now for decades, but in terms of running my consulting firm for over 11 years now, this is the very first time I have ever held a learning session on Sikhism. Now, if my Sikh parents were watching, they'd be like, Ritu, bad girl, why? But for myriad reasons, it didn't happen, but there's something that's been happening over the last several months that really, for me, lit the fire and spurred this moment. And so, in particular, I'm talking about the farmers' protests that are happening in India right now. There's been a lot of discussion, activity, commentary across social media. And so I'm really active on social media, on Instagram in particular. And my Instagram feed in certain moments over the last several months is like, literally read like an education forum on the farmers' protests, but there's been a lot of imagery as well, a lot of imagery of people, farmers from across faiths and cultures, languages, areas within India. But I have particularly gravitated to the images of Sikh farmers and Sikh people protesting. And it has been activating for me because it reminds me some of the imagery of the Sikh genocide back in the 80s. And I remember reading a little bit about how if you have, on Instagram in particular, if you have Sikh colleagues in this moment, it's important that you check in on them. If you have South Asian colleagues in this moment, it's important that you check in on them, Indian people in particular, to say, how are you doing in light of a lot of these protests that are happening? And I see a question from you, Peter, on why are the farmers' protests happening? We will talk about that in our webinar today. And so I thought to myself, wow, it's a really important point because, as you know from past webinars we've done, allyship is about checking in with people on how they're doing during difficult times. And as Amrita noted on the board, it's about checking in, not educating people. We're checking in to see, how are you doing? How are you feeling during this difficult moment? But I was thinking, but if you don't know about Sikhism or the Sikh genocide or what's happening in India right now, it'll be really hard for you to know that you should be checking in the first place. And so this is what really, for me, spurred this moment of, we should do a webinar on this. And in particular as well, in the context of all this anti-racism work that's been happening over the last year, I think a piece that is so interesting for us to explore is the intersectionality between faith and culture and racism and white supremacy. And I thought, you know what? And then Vaisakhi, the highest day of observance for the Sikh faith, is also coming up in April. I put this all together and I'm like, we should do a webinar on this. And so this is how we have come to this place today. And I thought I want to engage a few Sikh professionals who are highly knowledgeable, esteemed, and reputed in this space. And of course, I instantly, two names popped into my head: Ramandeep Grewal, one of my really good friends, and Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, also a good friend of mine. And here we are today. And so now I'm going to take a moment to introduce them to you. And I'm going to start off by introducing my dear friend, Raman Grewal. So Raman is an award-winning partner on Bay Street. So Bay Street, for those of you who don't know, would be akin to the American Wall Street, at a highly reputable Canadian law firm called Stikeman Elliott. And for those of you joining from the UK, it would be like a magic circle firm. She practices in corporate finance, securities, and M&A. She's on the firm's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Professional and Ethics Committee, in addition to being on the board for Sikhri, which is an organization committed to raising knowledge and awareness and community about Sikhism and for the Sikh community globally. She's a managing editor of the Corporate Governance Report and teaches on corporate governance matters for the business school or the Master of Finance program at York University. So basically, she's a total rock star. And on a personal note, I know Raman from now, like I'd say 20 to 25 years ago when we met volunteering in the Sikh community in Canada. But I would say Raman is a mentor to me. She's a dear friend. Oh, I'll get emotional. She's a dear friend. She is a confidant. She's a role model and inspiration. She's the first Dastar-wearing Sikh partner on Bay Street, which in and of itself is huge. I'm so proud of her, and it's such a great honor to introduce her today and to share this dialogue with her. So thank you so much, first of all, Raman, for joining us today. Oh, we're going to unmute you. Here you go. You just need to unmute your mic. Sorry, just one second. So there we go.
Yes, can you hear me now? Perfect. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much. This is it's wonderful. I would say it's a totally different feeling presenting to this type of an audience on this type of a subject, and already your sister and my sister are having a fight in the chat. So
amazing. This is so good. We have a lot of community joining today too. So this is one of the amazing things about the Sikh community. Your community comes out for you. So thank you so much for all of you, those of you who are joining us, including our sisters. Okay, so now what I want to do is introduce our second guest of today, Dr. Simran Jeet Singh. So Simran, what can I say? Like, so much to say about Simran. Recognized among top Time Magazine's 16 People Fighting for a More Equal America, Simran is Senior Advisor for Equity and Inclusion at YSC Consulting and a visiting professor at Union Seminary. He is a 2020 Equality Fellow with the Open Society Foundation, a Racial Equity Media Fellow with Interfaith Youth Corps, and a Senior Fellow for the Sikh Coalition. I don't know how you get work done. Okay, he's a highly sought after speaker on equity, diversity, inclusion, justice, anti-racism, which is actually how I met him in the first place. More on that in a moment. And his work, you're probably already familiar with him. His work is featured all over the place, from NPR to CNN to the recently the Time Magazine, the Washington Post, New York Times, and so much more. He holds a PhD, an MPhil, and MA from Columbia University, an MTS from Harvard University, and a BA from Trinity University. Your parents, your Indian, your Punjabi Sikh parents must be so proud of you. Good for you. And most importantly, and Raman, do you have your prop ready? He recently published the best-selling book, children's book, Fauja Singh, Keep Going, and basically chronicles Fauja Singh, the story of the oldest person alive to run a marathon. By the way, a little plug here, I ran a half marathon with Fauja Singh many, many years ago, back when I used to run. So amazing. So Simran, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you on today. So great to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you both. And it's nice to be with you all. So thanks.
Okay, so the three of us are going to be dialoguing about Sikhism and Sikhism on a whole, but also Sikhism in the workplace. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to make that happen. I have a list of set questions that I have already shared with Raman and Simran that I'm going to take them through, but we welcome any questions that you have. So please do put your questions up in the chat box, in the Q&A box. Before we dig in, though, I wanted to just get a feel for what's happening on this on our webinar today. So we have about 115 people who have joined. So if you identify as a Sikh person, you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a raise hand symbol. If you identify as being Sikh, can you click on the raise hand button? So can you raise your hand so we have a general sense of how many of you, of the 115 people who are joining so far, identify as being Sikh? Okay, so we have about 20-ish people of the community joining today who identify as being Sikh. So that's good and helpful for us, Raman and Simran, around framing remarks as well for the Sikh members joining us today. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, now here's another thing that I wanted to do. This will help us to better understand your framing about Sikhism as we dig in. So you'll see here that I have put up a poll questions for you. There are 3 questions that I'm inviting you to provide your answers on. So question number 1, so first of all, question number 1, how much do you know about Sikhism? And by the way, if it is very little, that's okay too. This is not about naming and shaming. This is about us understanding how deep we need to go. Second question, and this is a tough question, everyone, a very tough one, but I'm going to invite you to really dig deep and tune into how you're thinking and feeling. Are you aware that you hold biased beliefs about Sikhs? And then the third question, have you observed yourself engaging in micro-inequities towards Sikh people? So you can know that you hold biases. Knowing that you hold biases is one thing, but then seeing yourself act out on those biases is another thing altogether. So I'm going to give you another, let's say 5 more seconds to answer these questions, and I'm going to share the results here. Here we go. So you'll see here that the overwhelming majority of you have said very little. Many of you have said nothing or a little bit. By the way, like I think it's something like 12 of you have said a lot, which is really good. I presume that you are Sikh. For those of you who said a lot, most of you. Are you aware that you hold biases about Sikh people? Again, a lot of you have said somewhat or unsure or yes, and so we'll help to explore that today. And then have you caught yourself engaging in micro-inequities towards Sikh people? Most of you have said no. My hope is today in our conversation will help to be able to raise awareness about that as well. And so this data here, you'll see, will help to inform some of our comments today. So thank you so much for sharing. And I can already see questions coming in, which I love. Keep them coming as we roll. And what I want to do is let's start our questions now. And I want to start off by talking in particular about education around Sikhism, because as you'll see, Raman and Simran, the majority of people on today's webinar actually know very little about Sikhism. And of course, knowledge is power in interrupting biases that we hold about people for whom we have very little information. So it would be great to have each of you explain really quickly, say 90 seconds each, about Sikhism. So a 90-second primer about Sikhism. And Simran, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. Start with me because I'm the nerdy professor. Totally fine. So if someone asks me about Sikhism, there are 3 things that I'd want to say immediately. The first is that Sikhi is an independent religious tradition, one that was founded about 500 years ago in the Punjab region of South Asia. It has about 30 million followers worldwide, which makes it the world's 5th largest religion. So it's counted among the world's major religious traditions. That's one. The second is what are Sikhs about and what do they believe? And there are 3 core principles that I think are the building blocks of Sikh teachings. The first is oneness, this belief that the world is interconnected. It's the first thing we learn as kids. It's the first thing I learned from my parents. It's the first thing I've taught my daughters, that divinity is in each and every aspect of this world and each and every single person. The second principle there is love. If we truly believe and truly see our interconnectedness, then we love the world around us. We're constantly connected to it. And that's what a relationship looks like, a constant relationship, a constant remembrance of those that we love. And third, when we love, we are moved to serve. And that's the third core principle in Sikh teachings. We can think about that as justice. The language we use in our tradition is seva. And so that's the second point that I would want to make, that these are the 3 core building blocks of Sikh teachings: oneness, love, and service. And the last point I would want to make is in the Sikh tradition, and this feels really important to me as a practicing Sikh, that we believe a truly religious person is both spiritually committed and politically engaged. And it's born out of those same sort of theological principles I laid out. The language we use sometimes is Sant Sipai. Everyone should be a saint and a warrior, someone who takes care of themselves from the inside and serves the world around them. And I think those are the three main things that I would want to say about what Sikhism is about.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And so much of what you've said, I'm sure we're going to come back and pick up on. So, for example, the political emphasis of the work that we do. And so we'll come back to, and Seva in particular, we'll come back to that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Raman, 90 seconds to you.
So I would just say that that's a really good summary. The only thing I would add to that is Sikhism is one of the world's major religions, but it's the youngest one. And people may not realize that that actually has a permutation to all of those principles and tenets that Simran also spoke about. The philosophy is an evolving philosophy. Given the relatively young nature of Sikhism, it's informed by events that we would think that are still relatively, on the grander scheme of things, current as compared to the world's major religions. And then we are a tiny, tiny minority almost everywhere we go outside of Punjab, which is where Sikhs originate from. So less than 2% of a very large country being India, which is the region where most Sikhs originate. However, the diaspora, the Sikhs around the world, are everywhere and have been in many places for many generations. And so that means that Sikhs are also diverse when it comes to culture and when it comes to cultural practices. However, very vibrant, but still a minority. I would say an extremely vibrant minority wherever we go.
I love that. I love the term vibrant. And I would throw in attached to vibrant, like active, or just very, very active, given a lot of what Simran and Raman have shared. And it's probably one of the reasons you see us so active in this moment as well. And so many of us are so actively committed to social justice and community service and more. The other thing I just wanted to mention here, and this is like an interesting fact as it relates to Canadian data anyhow, that for example, there are more people in Canada who identify as being Sikh than identify as being Jewish. And so even though we often think that Sikhism is a small religion, and it is populous in many areas in the diaspora. So for example, in Canada, or for example, in the UK. So one of the things, as I just mentioned Judaism, one of the things I often find when I talk to some of my friends who are Jewish is that we will often compare and contrast differences between our cultures and our faiths. And one of the things that we'll often share is that like my Jewish friends will say, Judaism feels a lot like a culture and a faith to me. And I'll say back, yeah, I can really relate to that. Like for me, Sikhism feels a lot like a culture and a faith. And so I'm wondering, Simran, maybe if you could speak to this. So is Sikhism a faith? Is it a faith and a culture? I know we're using English language to describe practices that tie back to India and Eastern spirituality. How would you explain the comment that I've just shared?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that has pertinence for multiple communities. And maybe the most useful thing is to talk about this from a broader lens of religion and religious identity for those who are here interested in DEI perspectives. The way I'd answer that question from that lens is actually by doing the typical annoying professor thing and saying, well, it's both at the same time. And let me explain why, and I think this can actually be helpful. The animating question is, why do people of marginalized or underrepresented religious communities respond in this way to something that seems otherwise innocuous, right? Like, why would they be offended or at least uncomfortable with the category of religion? And that's because we presume religion to be a neutral category that is universally applicable. But the reality is that it's neither universal nor neutral. And to understand this, if we just sort of dig in a little bit historically, we can see that religion, the category of religion, the grouping of world religions, has a very specific history that's born out of modern Western European understandings. And so it both privileges Christianity, but it also takes Christianity as the very specific form of ideological understanding and then maps it on to the rest of the world. And so just to be very brief about this, and I can give you a specific example that might help illuminate this here. Within Protestant Christianity, which helped shape the category of religion, there's this idea that religion is privatized. It's something that we do at home. We don't do it out in public. And this Protestant idea of religion has come to be embedded in the very understanding of what constitutes a world religion. It's why we have come to distinguish between the religious and the secular, as an example, in the modern West. But for a lot of religious communities, and including for many Christians too, there's no way to separate out religion from public or corporate life. And this is why many people, including Sikhs, also Jews, and people of many religious traditions push back against the category of religion or being grouped as a religion because they find it confining to them and their way of understanding the world. And so that's a long way of explaining why both are simultaneously true, but at the end of the day, because these are categories that we presume to be neutral, but they're really not. The language itself actually keeps us from seeing the reality and keeps us from feeling comfortable in our authentic expression of ourselves.
Yeah, and Raman, I'm going to come to you, see if there's anything you want to add in there. Like, I would say on a personal note, I have deeply struggled trying to explain my Sikh identity to people through a Judeo-Christian lens, through a normative. And because the words, like even the words that we have in Sikhism, they don't literally translate into English. And then you're trying to use the English language to explain concepts that can't be explained because there are limitations to how to explain them using the English language. And it can be really isolating and difficult. And then also on top of that, from a workplace perspective, which we'll come to, as we know, in workplaces, and as many of you know, I have written a book on authenticity and how in workplace culture in particular, we feel so much pressure to conform and change who we are, to conform to dominant cultural normatives. It's like one of the areas of conformity that happens in the most prevalent way, but invisible way, is the push towards secularism in the workplace. But when you come from a culture / faith, like a faith, I call it faith as opposed to religion, that is so visibly demonstrative of some of the practices, it can be really, really difficult to navigate. And so your words really resonated with me. Raman, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I would just say, going back to something very simple that we learned very early on as Sikhs, is it's difficult for us to say that the term religion itself is problematic. And it's difficult for us because we feel it automatically boxes us in when we identify Sikhism as our religion. But we learn this when we're young kids. We always say it's our way of life. And getting to the concept that you're talking about, faith, it's our outlook. It's what we do. It's how we think about things. It's who we are. It's what informs us and makes us diverse as Sikhs as well. And really, I think that's why we feel limited and, also hesitant, because it doesn't fully bring out the real meaning of what we feel as Sikhs and who we are, and the way we internalize that. So yes, in certain ways, for some Sikhs, there is a very visible practice, practice element to it, but for many Sikhs there is not. And so by associating it with one set of Sikhs or with the visible practice element, we are also then alienating, I would say, the vast majority of Sikhs who maybe aren't automatically identifiable, however, have a very strongly held belief and would tell you that their way of life and their outlook and everything they do and how they think and the way they go through a life is very much influenced by their philosophy and their upbringing as a Sikh.
Mm-hmm. So let's. I touched on markers a moment ago, and we're now talking about Sikh identity as being broader than a religion and faith, incorporating culture. So Raman, you're wearing the star, which is one of the markers of Sikhism, and Simran, we can see you with your turban on. But let's talk a little bit about the star in particular, because I think in the Sikh faith, I think that people who are not Sikh often recognize Sikh men by way of the turban, but we're not often used to seeing Sikh women wearing the star, the head covering, the turban. And so could you speak to the wearing of the dastar in the context of Sikh identity and Sikh identity on a whole, being beyond just markers?
Yeah, for sure. And I like the way that you introduced the question because, people often say to me, what do I call your head covering? And I said, well, it's a turban. It's technically in Punjabi called a dastar. People call it a keski. We have all sorts of word names. I guess the focal point is you can't offend me. It doesn't matter. What we identify or the terminology is not sacrosanct. But what's important and kind of what is my own personal journey is, we are told as Sikhs, and we learn this, and this is my personal belief, that identity is a gift, and our identity and our ability to be able to associate ourselves, there's a whole historical and philosophical connection to that. And so for me, it was just a natural choice being a feminist and being, again, fully appreciative of all the gifts that my philosophy and the way of life and the upbringing as Sikh has given me, that I would want to identify as a Sikh, and I would want to have what I see as a privilege that many of my brothers had to be automatically identified as a Sikh. So to me, I see it as being something that is very much a privilege, but also it really gives me the full equality as a woman, as a practicing Sikh, of what I believe I'm owed. Now, I do want to make a point that many women wear dastars, many men wear dastars, and there is a different philosophical reason for that. People approach it in different ways. People have different reasons. People might have a different interpretation of scripture. They might have a different approach to the way that they believe. And so it's very important to understand that, again, there's a diversity among Sikh women who wear dastars as to why they wear dastars and what does dastars mean to them. But very much my personal journey is one of wanting to be associated and wanting to have the full privileges. I say, well, I have all the rights and obligations and I should have the privileges. And identity is really a privilege.
Thank you for sharing that. Simran, do you want to chime in on anything to do with Sikh identity and the markers of Sikhism, what wearing the turban perhaps means to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Raman, I love what you said and resonate with so much of it. And I think I'll just sort of share personally, there's a lot of, that there are many mixed feelings that many people have with regard to their identity. I think that's what you were alluding to, Raman, where you say people have different reasons for why they wear the turban, but also what it means to them. And I'll just share within my own family. I know that some of us feel more attached to our turbans because of the historical relationship and what it means to us in terms of our relationship to our tradition. And some it's more familial. And one of my brothers has said that the main reason that I care to do it is because it's part of what our family does, and it makes me feel like it's part. So I think that's really important, because if you read a textbook on Sikhism, you'll get maybe one or two answers over and over again of the why. But we have to remember that religious practice is incredibly diverse and subjective, and people are making these decisions for themselves. Why do some Sikhs not wear turbans? Why do some Sikhs cut their hair? Why do some Sikhs keep their hair? There are so many different reasons for all of these decisions, and it's not our job, especially in a workplace. And it's not fair for us to assume or to judge people based on how they practice their tradition, right? And I think that's a really important, I guess, build on what I was hearing Raman say.
So I love both of what you have shared, and I just want to highlight a few important points as it relates to biases about Sikhs in particular. So given I do deep dive bias work, and oftentimes in the context of faiths that where people wear head coverings, whether it be a dastar, a turban, a kippah, a hijab, I'll often hear that when people courageously admit, and by the way, I think it takes a lot of courage to share what I'm about to share with you, will courageously admit that they hold biased beliefs in their unconscious and then conscious minds, that those people who wear head coverings are oppressed, or women in particular, when they wear the stars or wear the star turban, are oppressed. Raman, and I always say, have you asked a person who wears a religious head covering, do you feel oppressed or are you oppressed? And the answer will be no. And I can say, I come from a community, my father wears a turban. If you were to ask him if he's oppressed, he's not oppressed. So Raman and Simran, do you feel oppressed in wearing your head coverings?
Do you want me to start in? I was going to say no. I think it's a resounding no. It's a resounding no.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let me ask you this, Raman, and then Simran, I'm going to come to you on a different side of this. So equity, equality, justice, huge underpinnings, as Simran alluded to earlier, underpinnings of our faith. Could you speak to gender equity in Sikhism? Because one of the biases that we often hear about in the context of Sikh people is that there's misogyny and sexism present. And so I think it would be important for us to speak to this.
Sure, I'm happy to start. And I think this goes all the way back to something that Simran said in the beginning, that, a fundamental basic tenet of Sikhism is oneness, a oneness of all beings, and the permutation or the presence of divinity in everything. And so when you start with a premise like that, you have no open room, you have no ability or possibility for any kind of discrimination or difference or, any kind of a paradigm that sets people differently. And very much from day one, and this is not just a philosophical interpretation, the Sikh gurus, who are our teachers, from whom we have most of our scriptures, were categorically very clear on the fact that there was, they had a long history of actively opposing gender discrimination and practices that, kept women in oppressed positions. And so gender equality, I would say to people, is a fundamental basic tenet, along with equality of all people. And so the wonderful thing, what it means is that's why if you have Sikh friends, you will notice very, very strong, independent, opinionated women from Sikh families who are not afraid to be who they are, because we are encouraged to be like that, just from our families from day one, from the way that we are taught. Again, going back to, for the most part, that's a Sikh philosophy, and that's what Sikh philosophy encourages. This concept of about being oppressed or being confined, a lot of people might think, having a visible religious identity is confining, or somehow means conformity, or is something that you're required to do, in order to be associated with your faith. And I always say to people, well, no. In fact, we see it as liberating, because, it allows us to be who we truly are, as opposed to conforming with what is the dominant culture, which can be very, very tiring, as we all know. And so, it's this openness to being yourself, and essentially being yourself, without all the trappings of what everyone else, would require you or assume that you would want to identify as. And the last point I'm going to make is that, even in that, we were talking about culture and religion and whatnot, and going back to one of the points is that Sikhs come from all sorts of places. They have all sorts of upbringings. They have all sorts of lenses. They bring their own biases as well. Is that fundamentally, from a Sikh philosophical perspective, there is absolute gender equality. In fact, there is not gender equality. I would say, Guru Nanak was a true feminist, because he did not just say women are equal. He said he eradicated this concept of a gender difference. He said there is actually no difference. So when you become a confirmed Sikh, a Khalsa, the language, the terminology, we have so many limitations in the English language. It actually doesn't exist. It actually just disappears, which in my mind is true feminism. But the last point I do want to make is, again, Sikhs, of course, are, very, very firmly intertwined with the cultures in which Sikhism grows. And so whether you're from the UK or Canada or the US or Malaysia or India, your culture also impacts or manifests on your practices. And so I'm not going to say that every single Sikh acts in a way that is, that there is no gender difference and there is no gender bias, because, part of calling out practices is being honest and being very transparent. Because of the cultural strains from which we come, we carry a lot of baggage. However, from a Sikh philosophical perspective, there is no gender bias. It is absolutely equality.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I have one thing that I want to say that we've already touched on, but I'm going to say it at the end. But I just wanted to continue on the theme about justice and our push for equity, equality in the Sikh faith. And Simran, could you speak to LGBTQ issues? Because I think that there's a perception that we are anti-LGBTQ. And I want to clarify that, because I hate it. So could you speak to that?
Sure, and you know there are multiple ways in which to address this question. You know, I'll start. I noticed Ritu's comment in the chat around the push and pull between the faith and the culture, and I think this is where Raman was going in her comments. That there is in the Sikh tradition, in our teachings, there's absolutely no space for discrimination on any grounds. That's the ultimate teaching in our tradition, because what we learn is, if you truly believe that the divinity is pervading every single person, then what grounds do you have to discriminate? How can you, as we say in our scriptures, how can you call anyone good or bad, right? Everyone just is. Everyone is divine. And so in the tradition, there's no space for discrimination, but unfortunately in South Asian culture, homophobia is a real problem. Misogyny is a real problem. Racism and colorism is a real problem. So all of these things that we are taught not to believe in are surrounding us at all times. And this is also true when we live in the diaspora as well, right? In the US, it might not be casteism that we're dealing with, but there is racism, there's still misogyny, there are all sorts of, there's ableism, there's age, like all these things are all around us. And so what do we do when we have these aspirations that we're trying to live by, and yet we're constantly being bombarded with messages that people around us are inferior on the basis of their identities? And so that's a real challenge that you see the Sikh community struggling with. And it's not a new challenge. It's a longstanding challenge. Now, I think the LGBTQ question is especially meaningful to me for multiple reasons, but the biggest one, I think, is this might be a funny way to say it, actually, that, you know, I've been called all sorts of racist names my whole life. Like, they don't bother me. Like, all those stereotypes of, you know, Bin Laden, Al Qaeda, ISIS, like,
like the list goes on, right?
Yeah, like it's fine. But the moment someone assumes that I'm homophobic, like I struggle so hard with that, and I know where it comes from. I know there's a bias that when you see someone who's visibly religious, because of what we see on TV constantly, right? Anybody who is visibly religious is a fundamentalist. They're hardcore, right? They are conservative. And so their perspectives on what religious commitment looks like, quite physically, because of the same bias that I was talking about earlier of privatizing religion, right? So if you're willing to show up and be public about religion, you must be so hardcore that you're an exclusivist and unwilling to consider anyone's. And that's not true.
Right.
and I'm with you that it really bugs the hell out of me. And so there is something really important to take away here, I think, both in our understanding of Sikh perspectives, but in general, how we think about religious diversity. And that is, just because you think someone is religiously committed, and because you have presumptions about what religious commitment means in social and political context, that's not always going to be true.
Right.
And I think it's really important for us to check those.
I think that point is so brilliant. It's almost like you read my mind, because it's a segue into the point that I wanted to make before we move forward, which is biases are the automatic snap judgments we make both consciously and unconsciously about who people are, tied back to the way they speak, the way they look, the way they dress, so much more. You'll know this from attending our other BCI webinars. And so I think one of the key takeaways here is the bias for you to think about as it relates to your experiences in the workplace and Sikh professionals you're interacting with, is when you see the markers of Sikhism and pronounced markers like the star, the turban, start to clock. Where does your brain go? Does your brain go to labels like conservative, traditional, fanatic, terrorist? And by the way, I'm using language, not that's correct, obviously. I'm using language that these are commonly held biases in the workplace around who Sikhs are. So where does your brain go? Boring, sterile, won't drink, won't have fun, won't party. And actually then if that's where your brain goes, then ask yourself, why is it that my brain attaches fun with alcohol, fun with partying, fun with people can party and not drink? Or so where does your brain go when you see the markers? But at the same time, I'm gonna flip it the inverse too. Like, as you'll see, I, as a Sikh woman, do not wear the star or a turban or a scarf to cover my head. And I would say I'm hardcore as a Sikh. And when I say hardcore as a Sikh, like as you'll know from following me on Instagram, like my heartbeat, everything I do is committed to equity. Like in every single thing I do, I'm about equity and service and seva. So the opposite inference ought not be drawn about me either. And this is what interrupting biases is about, clocking where your brain goes when you are interacting with people. And we'll send you some bias tip sheets after today to help there. So, okay, we have about 15 minutes of time remaining. Time flies, an hour is never enough. And we know this because when you send us the evaluation, like you're gonna say this and I know this. Anywho, but thank you for your feedback. Keep your feedback coming. We love feedback. Keep sending in the feedback. So let's talk about what are some important things, important aspects of the Sikh experience that people need to know about in order to be more inclusive with in their interactions with their Sikh colleagues. So like what's happening with the farmers' protests? Maybe Simran, we can start with you, and then Raman, maybe we can have you talk about the Sikh genocide in the 80s. Like, so what do people need to know so that they can be more inclusive and empathetic and compassionate, serve as better allies in the context of their Sikh friends, colleagues, and more?
Sure. Yeah, I'll say two things just as a preface to my remarks. One is Raman made this really important point earlier, that is Sikhs are on the margins all over the world. And it's kind of funny to me when people say, go back to where you came from, meaning, I don't know what they mean, but I assume they mean to go back to India, but Sikhs are on the margins in India too. And that's really important to recognize. The second is, and you were alluding to this in your last comment, Ritu, the experience of Sikhs in the modern West in the post 9/11 moment, where racism has always been a challenge for Sikhs in the West, but especially over the past 20 years with presumptions of terrorism and violence and fanaticism, that's led to real harm. And it's easy to sort of point our fingers and say, well, the people who commit hate crimes are condemnable, and we would never do anything like that. But these stereotypes have really affected all of us, right? Whether we recognize it or not. And I think that's an important part of the Sikh experience. And it has really led to, and I've experienced it myself, a lot of challenges in the workplace, in applying for jobs and job interviews. There have been some really strange and unexpected questions, and that's probably a nice way to say it, that I know no one else would have been asked, and they're coming because of how I look and what people presume about me. So those are two things that I think are key for understanding Sikh experiences today. And with regard to the farmers' protest, I'll just say it very briefly, that there is, in India right now, the government has passed a few new laws, not yet implemented, but inevitably so, that will disadvantage the farmers and benefit massive corporations. And so this has led to a large protest. The protest is not just because of the laws. There's a long history of the government turning its back on farmers. And Punjab, the homeland of the Sikhs, is largely agrarian. And the Sikhs of Punjab have initiated a protest that has now become nationwide and actually worldwide. They, for months, have been sitting on the streets of India's capital in New Delhi, protesting these laws, demanding they be repealed. They've been subjected to a number of human rights violations, including detentions, police brutality, internet shutdowns. And one of the incredibly frustrating things with this is the world has not paid attention and the world has not weighed in. A few celebrities have, mostly women and women of color. But for the most part, the global media has touched on it. Global superpowers, political leaders have not. And that's been really disappointing in light of the hypocrisy around human rights violations, right? So on the one hand, when we have countries who are engaged in human rights violations where there is no economic benefit, we won't hesitate to call them out. But the moment we see a potential economic partner and a political ally committing atrocities, they won't, right? And so that, I think, has been an important part of the feeling for Sikhs, that if we weren't so far on the margins. If people really understood us, maybe they would understand what this protest was about, and they would be in support of it. But again, it's being on the outside of all of these conversations and not having the power to really shape the narratives in a public way. It feels like a real disadvantage to a lot of Sikhs who have been activated in the diaspora and in the homeland.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And, I'm sure your words resonate with a lot of the people who are tuning in today from the diaspora. It's interesting because when I think back to the Sikh genocide in the 80s, and Raman, I would love to come to you. Maybe you could just provide a little bit of insight there about that. One of the things I used to say is, like, in 1984, like in the year with the seat of the genocide, people didn't care about brown people. White supremacy permeated ideology back in the 80s that prevented people from the global community from tuning in addition to the fact that there was less social media, there was no social media and more. But here we are in 2020, 2021, we have social media, we have the internet, but we still have white supremacy, which prevents us from a global perspective and holding governments, nations, states, people accountable for racist acts, xenophobia, oppressive actions, and more. And so we're seeing it play out again. But and this is why it's so important as an act of allyship, and our commitment to equity, that we all collectively, regardless of our background, use our voice and actions to call out injustices and oppression. So Raman, I'd love to have you touch on the Sikh genocide and provide a little bit of information. And while you're doing that, you'll notice, everyone, that in the chat board, Ashley has provided you with a link to the evaluation survey for today's session. If you want to complete that now, we'll also send you an email afterwards with a bunch of resources for additional learning and tips, and we'll include the link there if you want to do it after, because you want to focus for the next 8 minutes, knowing that there is no such thing as multitasking. It doesn't work. All right, so Raman, over to you.
Happy to. And in the context of my answer, I'm going to try to answer a whole bunch of questions I saw in the chat board as well, because I'm going to build up to the genocide. So as we mentioned, it's a young religion, largely formed kind of developed in the 15th century in Southeast Asia, where the dominant religions were Islam and Hinduism. So two very, very dominant religions, but is distinct and different from both. And so a large part of the Sikh existence has been, keeping and, carving out and keeping and protecting that distinction. So when you see and you hear Sikhs, you'll see Sikhs talking about identity, sovereignty, which means personal sovereignty and community sovereignty. Sikhs have a very strong held belief about freedom of expression and freedom of religion, which goes back to a whole bunch of, a lot of historical context around a philosophy that does not believe there is only one way to spirituality, and therefore, has a great deal of respect for any spiritual path, does not have a concept of active proselytization or conversion, but has this whole open concept of acceptance of everyone, which also means that, 500 years of protecting this very tiny minority and its very distinct history and existence. And so fast forward to pre-colonial India, where Sikhs actually for a short period of their history had their own sovereign territory. If you are interested in anything about, Sikh art or, Sikh culture, you'll see the vast majority of what we have in the field of Sikh art comes from that period. And then, lo and behold, like everywhere else in the world, the British come and dominate and leave and draw lines and, leave people in all sorts of places where they shouldn't be, alongside with all sorts of neighbors, but they probably shouldn't be with. And so we've had a long history of post-independence India of, again, working politically and otherwise to protect this sovereignty and to protect this identity. And so 1984 was a culminating point where, the Sikh community went head to head with what at that time was the Indian government. There was a long struggle for a greater rights for Sikhs, actually started in a struggle for greater agrarian rights. Interestingly, fast forward to farmers' protests today. It was more about political sovereignty for the state of Punjab, and then ultimately ended up in what was a attack on the most sacred place in Sikhism, which is the Harmandir Sahib in Amritsar. Thousands and thousands of people killed in that attack, but also in the retribution, post the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984, there was as Sikhs believe, a planned genocide to send a message to eliminate Sikhs, and many people who are here today. And the important thing to understand is many of us actually, Sikhs do have this collective sense of this collective traumatic experience. This community trauma actually permeates many things we do. Those of us who were around in the early 80s, it is a lived experience for us. So many of you, if you remember where you were when those planes hit the Twin Towers, it is a experience that will be with you for the rest of your lives. We were there when we looked at the paper and saw the attack on Harmandir Sahib, or we opened the news and we saw people being, burned alive in the streets of New Delhi. So this collective trauma actually does very much inform who we are. But also, the great thing about it is it impels us to never be silent. And so whether it is, Simran said this, I think this goes right back to the beginning, this idea that we have an obligation to stand up and an obligation to call out bias and to call out discrimination and to call out injustice and inequity, because we have a very recent experience with how, unchecked power can actually be very, very corruptive. And we have a natural distrust for institutions for that reason. It impels us to continuously ask questions. And so if you do feel like your Sikh friends are, maybe a little bit more active in general, or always have opinions, or always out there, and this is not just on Sikh issues or South Asian issues, but on every issue you can possibly imagine, it is, again, a part of that lived experience coming out of that, very short history of what has been very, I would say, short but very, very vibrant history again.
Yeah. Thank you, Raman, for sharing that. In fact, I was like, you so eloquently captured a very deep, long, painful experience. And so I'm really grateful for your explanation. And, as you were sharing, like I could even feel in my body, as some of you know, I teach in the area of healing racial trauma. And one of the things I often talk about is my trauma that ties back to the Sikh genocide. So even as Raman was speaking, I could feel the emotion surging in me. And so this is something for everyone tuning in today. If you are Sikh and you feel that surge of trauma, fear not, there are resources out there to help you. And we'll send you some resources today. And then in addition, for those of you who are not Sikh, the point that I wanted to start to use to help in the wind down, and then Simran and Raman, I'm going to come to you for your final words, and then we'll do our final wrap up, is so one thing from each of you that you want to leave our audience members with. For those of you who are not Sikh, who are joining today, allyship for those in the Sikh community looks a lot like what we've already talked about. So first of all, calling out the biases that you yourself hold around when you see a Sikh person. Where does your brain go? What meanings does your conscious and unconscious brain attach to who they are? It's about you working very hard to interrupt those biases so that you're ensuring with your Sikh colleagues at work, you're providing excellent opportunities to sponsorship, to mentorship, to stretch assignments, that you're recruiting people and working very hard to move them up into the leadership roles within your organizations, that at social events, whether they're virtual or in person, you're going out of your way to make it sure that people experience belonging, they feel seen, and that you're not pushing conformity tied back to a white Judeo-Christian normative around behavior. It's about learning about Sikhi and Sikhism so that you have a very good understanding of what Sikhism is about, but not relying on your Sikh friends and colleagues to educate you about Sikhism, because as you'll know from my past webinars on allyship is about us doing the self-work to learn about faiths, cultures, practices that are unbeknownst to us, so that we don't put the onus on people to educate us. And learning more and having conversations with your friends and colleagues who are Sikh about their culture, by starting first by sharing your own culture. And in fact, in my book, The Authenticity Principle, if you have it, in chapter 10, I talk about how it is that you can ask people more about their cultural practices, and I give you the formula. We'll also send you a link to a Walrus talk that I did about it. So those are some key takeaways for you as it relates to allyship. Now I'd love to give Simran, and why don't we go with you first, Simran? Under a minute, what's your takeaway for the audience? And as you're sharing, I'm actually going to bring up a slide that shows you how you can keep in touch with Simran, learn more about Simran's work going forward. So Simran, your comments?
Awesome, thank you. I would say it's in the DEI space, we tend to shy away from conversations around religion. And for good reasons. I think we're uncomfortable. We don't know how to talk about it. It's highly personal. But it's critical. It has a lot to do with how many people in our workplaces and in our communities understand themselves and how they live their lives. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to open up the space. I would also say there's something within religious practice that's really useful within the context of DEI work, and that's the practice of introspection. You have to, if you're really committed to anti-racism, you have to go within yourself and excavate and explore and examine. And so, one of the teachings we get from our tradition, our fifth prophet, Guru Arjan Sahib, says, Bande khoj dil har roj. It's every day, search within your heart. And I think that's such a beautiful message. It's something that I try and do based on that wisdom, and it's really served me well. And I would encourage you all to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Simran, and thank you so much for joining today. And then, Raman, I'm going to invite you to share your final takeaway for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. So I asked my kids this question, what do you think the takeaway should be? And interestingly, both of them said the same thing. The two I asked is that, we are very open. If you have a question, just ask. Sikhs love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about their experience and their culture. There is so much to share. And so, going back to what, you are always underscoring, Ritu, in your seminars, don't make assumptions. It's okay to ask, and it's okay to approach those conversations in workplaces. And we understand that there's a lot of learning, that our way of life or our faith is one that is probably the least known. And there's a lot of misconceptions, as we've been covering through this hour. And so we love the opportunity to deal with those misconceptions and try and educate for our part as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I just need a minute or minute and a half longer with you all, and then everyone, fear not, we're done. Let me just do a few housekeeping matters before I officially wind down. So first of all, here are ways that you can connect in with future webinars at BCI. For those of you, it's the first time you want more, please sign up for our mailing list at BhasinConsulting.com. Other ways to get a hold of me. As you know, I always say that if you wait for perfection in your equity, inclusion, diversity efforts, perfection never exists. It doesn't exist. It will not come, and it will cause you to remain silent and lead to inaction. Do your best, and as you do your best, you realize my best is not good enough, and so you keep moving the needle and keep growing and growing in the work that you're doing. So don't wait for perfection. Just start today based on what we've talked about. We hope that you'll avail the resources we'll send to you. Please fill out the evaluation form. Please sign up for our mailing list and see what future webinars. I want to say thank you to Dr. Simranjit Singh. Thank you for joining today, sharing your words. Raman, Grewal, thank you for joining. Thank you both for being my friend as well. I know this is going to sound cheesy, but I often will think to myself, the universe sends me love through who they encase me with, surround me with, and I'm looking at the two of you today, and I'm thinking, I'm so blessed, and I'm so grateful for you both. So thank you for enriching my life and for enriching everyone's lives. And then the final thing I want to say is, and also thank you to Ashley of my team. You're part of the people I'm encased by, and I appreciate all of the work that you do and the whole team at BCI. And to all of you for joining today. And the last thing I wanted to say is, I just want to honor all of the farmers in India right now and all the protesters in India right now, and to all the people around the world in this moment who are using their voice and actions to interrupt oppression, to fight the fight, so that we all can collectively experience justice, equity, love, respect, and more. I honor you, I feel you, and we are sending you our collective energy. So thank you everyone for joining. We will see you next month for more. Be well, be safe, be whole, be happy. And of course, for the Sikhs joining, Fateh. You'll know what I mean. Okay, bye everyone.